I am putting
Just
it
reading it.
putting on YouTube as we speak. And
Okay, so you got to hit got it if you've got it. So so I'm really pleased that that I was pushed into action to give Worship and Study a chance to observe Human Rights Shabbat. There were many different options we could have taken, but what I want to thank Jim Leffert for really pushing me on this, and I want to thank also Miriam Cantor, who said, "Don't, you know, if you want to do something on Shabbat, that's fine, but you should also do something on a Sunday night, so those of us who don't come to the Shabbat service can also participate." So I want to thank you both for sort of making this suggesting this would be a good format. And I want to thank everybody who came on Saturday and is also here today or just came today. And we had a good discussion about Vayigash, the parsha of the week, in which we looked at some of the aspects of Joseph and Judah and their time in Egypt and their subservience to Pharaoh, the absolute ruler. And we talked a little bit about some of the human rights implications of very unequal societies and of rulers, and what happens when rulers take power, and then what happens when absolute rulers take absolute power and they tend to be corrupt or absolutely corrupt. I want to thank the people who brought up those perspectives. And I also want to thank Mikkel Goldman, who I hope will join us before too long, because she talked very eloquently about the current status of human rights concerns, particularly as with respect to the climate change and climate crises and the numbers of people who are going to be displaced or already in the process of displacement, who need safe places to begin lives anew. This is certainly one of the really great human rights issues of our time. And many of us, when we read the account of Israelites in Egypt, what we think about are the climate crises of those times and the way in which people sought sanctuary in Egypt. And just as a fun little aside, there are some interpretations that say that the actual historical people who sought residence in Egypt during a terrible famine and drought in Canaan were actually the Edomites. So that's kind of interesting from a biblical and historical perspective. But what I'd like to talk about today is really the additional perspectives that were raised by the series of lectures, and particularly Alicia Wiesel's lecture in the 3-part lecture series at the Elie Wiesel Center that every year now after his death has sponsored Elie Wiesel Memorial Lectures. And this year the topic was human rights and civil rights. And I thought that in lieu of trying to find a separate speaker to talk to us as a very small congregation, that it would be really effective to piggyback on the kinds of events that are taking place in our greater Boston Jewish community, and to use these as a place to really expand and deepen discussions around the points in which they were raised. And I was particularly impressed with the lecture series that the Elie Wiesel Center ran, and in particular wanted us to draw attention to and discuss Alicia Wiesel's lecture, The Lessons That He Took from His Father. On the evening of November 18th, 2021, which was, we can call it in sort of Jewish parlance, we would call it Erev, the marking of Erev Kristallnacht in the horrendous German Jewish history. Alicia Wiesel, the son of Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and human rights advocate and activist, Elie Wiesel, gave a talk which focused on his father's principles of activist engagement. And he extracted from his lessons of his father, 11 principles, which I think it's very worthwhile for us to discuss as citizens and as Jews. And I'm just going to summarize them, not by numbers, but just sort of talk about what are these principles that he derived. And in the process of giving us these principles, what Alicia also did was he looked at his father's human rights history in terms of the history of human rights across the world. And just as background to that, what I want to point out in addition is that the human rights legacy that we celebrate is actually an international human rights legal system that begins with the 1948 Declaration, International Declaration of Human Rights, 1948 International Declaration of Human Rights, which is more or less the charter for the United Nations. And it establishes the principle of basic civil, political rights and economic, social, cultural rights, that every human being should be equal in dignity with basic rights to a decent life. But it's important to also think about this not only as a legal system, but also as a system that has political economic dimensions. And Elie Wiesel's legacy is very important because he spoke truth. What is that, please? Could someone try to mute themselves, please?
Agree with it.
And he spoke truth to power. I mean, he dealt with heads of state to try to make heads of state conform to the basic principles of human rights and human dignity that are enshrined in these United Nations documents. And it's also important to look at a third dimension, which lawyers often don't look at, which is the sociocultural dimension, that in order for societies and the individuals who make up societies to adhere to human rights, it has to resonate with them in their own cultural terms. So this becomes a way in which we as Jewish Americans can encounter Elie Wiesel with respect to his promoting human rights in the US and also in the world. So what were these principles? And we're going to talk about these principles. The way we're going to set this up is we're going to have, I'll do this brief introduction, and then we'll have two sets of breakout rooms where in smaller groups, you'll be able to discuss these principles. So what are these principles? In simple, basic terms that Elisha took away from his father's, number one, he said his father was a good listener. He had excellent listening skills. So this would be the first principle. You know, if you want to be a human rights activist, what you really have to understand is what each side is saying, and that means you really have to know how to listen. He saw his father as a quintessentially great listener. Second, a human rights activist has to have respect for the human dignity of all others. And I think what impressed him over and over again was the way his father was able to express respect for others, even where he didn't agree with them. And this is something I think that this respect for others, for all others, is something that is truly lacking and progressively eroding in our own society. I think it's something that we can talk about as well, but respect for the human dignity of all others. Third principle would be the willingness to dialogue with those holding opposite and sometimes oppressive views. And he saw Elie Wiesel speaking to tyrants to try to get them to change their behavior. So he would listen respectfully, and then he would try to find ways to get them to think and reflect and change their oppressive behaviors. So there was this willingness to dialogue with those who he didn't agree with. But he was also very careful to set boundaries. And I think we saw this most eloquently in the case of Elie Wiesel dialoguing with Ronald Reagan, where he tried to get Reagan to follow a decent and a moral course. That said, that is, you listen respectfully and you respect the human dignity of others, one should not tolerate but always correct lies. So this was the case when he was dealing with tyrants in Eastern Europe. He corrected their lies. No, you're lying, he would say to one of the oppressive Eastern European tyrants. Another dimension that he saw his father really promoting is the recognition that words, that is righteous statements, it's easy enough, well, maybe not so easy, but it's easier to make righteous statements than to take action. And Elie Wiesel said, no, you can't just make statements, you actually have to take action. You have to lead and push those who should take action to action. And one should not expect, however, that conventional leaders will necessarily embrace the right path until pushed. And for me, the most important lesson here was the story very early on in Elie Wiesel's activism in the 1960s, where Elie Wiesel was one of the chief activists for Soviet Jewry. And what he realized was the big Jewish agencies in the US were not going to take action. There had just been, there was this movement toward détente with the Russians. It was not viewed as politically convenient. And yet, Elie Wiesel knew the freedom for the Russians had to be front and center. And so he got youth to take action. For him, this was a really important step, that you get the youth out there demonstrating in front of the Soviet embassy. And I was one of those kids out there. All of our synagogues, bussed us into New York to demonstrate on behalf of Soviet Jewry. And then slowly, not necessarily kicking and screaming, but slowly, the major conventional Jewish agencies followed, because it was the right path, but they weren't going to take leadership in this. But the important lesson here was for the human rights activist was, be really careful. Don't go slandering and speaking nasty words toward the conventional agencies, because you're going to have to bring them along. And they're the ones that will eventually take the most effective action. But you start and they will follow. And this idea that you don't ruin your relationships with those who you want to bring along with you, it's a very important lesson that I'm not sure, again, is a lesson that is being heard and followed in our current environment, at least in the activism circles that I follow. So there it is. So the established institutional leaders aren't going to take the first dangerous steps in challenging human rights violations, but the firebrands, and in particular youth, can advocate for righteous changes in behavior and therefore set the agenda that the better equipped establishment actions and agencies will follow. And he also is very careful to say, and don't worry who takes credit. And that's also an important lesson. The final series of lessons are that adversaries should always be treated with care and dignity and warned to change behaviors rather than insulted and embarrassed outright. And opponents should not be vilified, but firmly countered with principled and opposing views and given an opportunity to change their wrongful positions. And the most important incident or series of incidents in this case was Elie Wiesel's dealing again with President Ronald Reagan in the case of Reagan's visit to Germany, to Wittenberg. So these were the lessons, and Elie Wiesel, that I'd like you to be thinking about, which are most important to you and which have in some way affected your life or might affect your life. And then finally, what I'd also like us to be thinking about is the final discussion point that was raised in the question and answer period, where Elie Wiesel, who was a dedicated and observant Jew, who moved in multiple European, US, and international political circles, who was a citizen of the world and who championed human rights of oppressed peoples everywhere, still, when questioned what was most important for him as an activist, answered it was always very important for him, and this is how he also counseled his son. It's always important to remember, it was important for him to remember who he was and to remain true to himself. So the message here is, you must always, know who you are and take action based on that knowledge. And he also responded implicitly or responded to the implicit rather than explicit question, how would he like to be remembered? And he said to his son, I would like to be remembered as a good Jew. So an important question here is like, what does that mean to you? And how would you respond to that kind of question about how would you like to be remembered in terms of your own legacy for taking action on righteous causes? So here we are, and these are some of the questions which I hope that we can discuss. And I would like to, before we go on to breakout rooms, I guess I'd like to, first of all, just ask for any hands, and you can raise your hands by pressing the reactions button on the bottom of your screen, and it will give you a raise hand function. Or if you have a tablet, it'll be to the top right of your screen. Or you can just raise your hand and I'll look for them across the little boxes of your faces. But I'd just like to ask if you have any immediate questions or responses, and also whether anyone at this point just wants to say a few words, remembering the legacy of Ruth Anna Putnam and Hillary Putnam in relation to past human rights events. And I'll just see if we'll take a few minutes for this, and then we'll move into breakout rooms, and I'll put the questions for the breakout rooms in the chat. So let me see. And if you raise your hand through the function, you immediately go to the first part of my screen so that I can see you. And Jim, you never disappoint. So why don't you just take it away while I'm putting the questions
Well,
in the
you
chat.
provided me with a cue there. While I was talking with you about your plan to organize this event, I was thinking that we try to have events every year to commemorate Human Rights Shabbat. And the thought occurred to me that if Arminian was going to have any kind of annual special event, I thought it would be nice to name it in the memory of Ruth Anna. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
All right. And any other comments here? Okay. And Jim, can you put your hand down so that
Okay.
we can-
Miriam was raising her hand, I think.
who is?
I was.
Oh, Miriam, yes. I'm sorry. I'm
was-
not good at multitask. I'm not as good as I used to be at multitasking.
Well, and I'm not as adept at using, the technology as some people are. But when I think of Ruth Anna, she is an absolute example of all of the things that Elisha Wiesel said were characteristic of his father. Go down the whole 11 things in the way that he phrased them, and they fit Ruth Anna perfectly in terms of how she approached every person in any interaction that I saw her in, and always at the forefront of advocating for everything good. And with a beautiful talent for seeing whatever kernel of good there was in another person. And it showed in simple things, just in our discussions in shul, the way she might rephrase what someone had said in a comment on the drash, so that she could find something meaningful on which she would compliment the person before she went on to suggest some thoughts of her own, shall we say. Her steady support for other organizations, and I remember Amnesty International among others, but she would be regularly bringing to our attention different things we might do. Her participation in the Walk for Hunger year after year, long after her body really didn't have the strength for it, but somehow her mind got it to work so that she could do it. And I remember one time when a group of us were in a class, and I'll let the other participants remain nameless, but it was before the walk. So, of course, she was inviting us to do what we should and sponsoring her. And one person gently pointed out how many other people he was already sponsoring. And she just looked at him and said, so, a most gentle way of bringing
Uh-huh.
someone along. And it strikes me as I was looking over some notes I had on the lecture and listening to your rephrasing these principles that a lot of them applied when I was doing negotiating in my profession. You know, this was not totally the mind of a journalist operating, although certainly in his use of his microphone, that was something Elie Wiesel excelled at. But he was a prime negotiator. All these principles about how you listen to the other and respect the other, and but nonetheless are firm in advocating. Absolutely, they're not so much principles as techniques, but boy, are they effective.
That's wonderful. That's a really great lead into our breakout rooms. But before we go into breakout rooms, Petra, who's this wonderful little person here who's joining our conversation?
That's Maeve, Josh's baby girl, who's almost 6 months old.
Wow,
She's darling.
just wonderful. What a
Thank
treasure.
you.
What a treasure. Thank you for letting us have the nachas of seeing her. Thank you, Josh. Yeah, she's really alert. Yes. Yeah, and if she could write with her feet are really are moving around there.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we have 14 people, not counting Maeve, in our group. So I'm going to divide us into 3 breakout rooms. And these will be breakout rooms of about 4 people apiece. I'll circulate among them, in which you notice there are 2 questions here in the chat, which you can keep referring back to. The first looks, it's just basically saying Elisha Wiesel indicates 11 lessons he took from his father's human rights advocacy and activism, which are important to you, and what experience have you had that relate to these lessons? So that's the first one. And the second one is that Elie Wiesel is a spokesperson for human rights and a tireless champion of social justice in high political circles. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, said, "I want to be remembered as a good Jew." So what does that mean to you? And as you contemplate your own legacy, especially with regard to justice and human rights, how do you respond to this question and why? So I'm going to put you into breakout room. I'm going to let the program do that. So nobody, as Jim Morgan just said to me, so no one can blame you for putting you in with certain people. And I'll circulate among you. And what we can do, let's start with the first question. It's now almost 8 o'clock. So let's start with the first question about which of these 11 lessons is most important. What experiences have you had that relate to this? And then we'll come back after, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes. We'll come back and talk about that, and then we'll take up the second question again in breakout rooms. So let me divide you. And
Ellen.
Yeah.
I'm at 1795. That phone number is the same as me. I've had some audio problems, so don't split us apart.
It's the same person. 2 screens.
Sam and 1795 telephone is the same.
If it turns out you get split, I'll move you around. Okay. Let's just see how this works when I assign them automatically. So which are yours, Sam?
I'm both, but 1795 I'm vocal in.
Okay, you're in room 2. Both of your identities are in room 2. You're all set. So you'll all be given the prompt to join. And is
And
everybody
each room supposed to consider the same two questions?
Each room will be considering the same two questions.
Got it.
I've not been,
Anybody not get anywhere?
for some reason, I've not been offered a room. No,
Oh, because they think you're going to float.
Okay.
Do you want to float, or would you like to be? So what you can do,
Why don't I go where,
what
do
you
I-
can do, you can simply join. Why don't you join room 2?
let me see if I
Because that's the one that's got a double Sam.
got it. Huh,
So
Oh.
what you do is you put your cursor over the number room 2, the number 4. You put your cursor over that,
okay.
and you should be able to it should say join, and you can just stay there.
How's that? That's very.
It's not working.
Oh, no. Oh, here we go. Breakout rooms. I put my cursor, oh, join. There we go. Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, and this program actually works differently. The Zoom room that I use at Boston University, when I come back into the main room, I have to remember to unmute myself, but I'm unmuted here, which is nice. So let's see if everybody else shows up. Slowly, slowly.
Here comes Sherry.
Yeah.
You're gonna, I mean, all the breakout rooms are self-destructing within seconds, so everyone will be back who is willing to come back. So
Yeah. Yeah.
they don't.
Yeah. I hope you all had good discussions. I mean, when I kind of, as I floated between rooms, I sensed there were really good substantive discussions going on. We're still missing one.
One Sam.
No, we're,
Elaine
okay,
is
there's
here.
Miriam. So I know at least one, Miriam and Adina, you're there.
Yeah,
I think
And
Elaine doesn't.
Maury,
Helene didn't make it.
Elaine had to answer phone. There was a phone call, I think.
Right,
and
and
muted.
I think we lost Maury also.
No, I'm here.
You're
No,
here,
he's
okay,
here.
all right,
can see
you're
him.
not, I didn't see you on my participant list.
Oh, well.
Anyway, so first of all, I want to thank you all for participating actively in these
hi.
breakout rooms. I hope the format, allowing you more time to really talk, worked for you in terms of your sharing some topics here. We have 2 minutes. Does anybody have any closing comments they'd like to offer or put into the chat?
I just want to echo what Sherry said at the very end, which I think was really important, which is that she wanted to be remembered as someone who's always looking to have a good laugh. And
That's right.
that's one of the things about many of the most effective activists I know is that they have a sense of humor. They can sort of see beyond
Well, thank you. That's an important characteristic. Anyone else have another closing insight?
Yeah, thinking about it today, it seemed to me the two poles of the discussion are whether you have the wherewithal to be a Gandhi and stay with it, or you're going to be Esther and Mordecai and take action.
Well, some might take issue with you that Gandhi was not an activist, but the other reference from the Book of Esther are germane, certainly.
I mean, Sam is talking about violence versus nonviolence, because certainly the action that Esther and Mordecai ended up taking led to was explicitly violent. I don't know if that's what Sam.
I
This was
just
great,
wanted to
Alan.
say-
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
This was great.
So I think maybe we should move back to Sherry's. Let's remember that we can be serious and have very confrontational and also very meaningful conversations and dialogues, and that we can also make sure that we don't forget that laughter has a place too.
Amen.
I think
So-
it's nice for us as a group to have more experiences like this,
Hmm.
where we are sharing our ideas and our thoughts about activism and where that might lead, or where as individuals or collectively. I think it's a dimension of Arminian's activities that needs to be nourished, and
Okay.
that benefit from nourishing it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for participating. And
Thank
and
you
I
for
want
organizing and
Ellen,
for
thank-
your talks
yes,
and
thank
for
you.
your encouragement.
and I want to
Yes,
stay.
thank
I want to stay true to the 1 hour time limit, so you can all go on with your lives, as with laughter and whatever activism are in your plans for this evening. And and I wish you all a Shavua Tov, a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay well, everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.
So long,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Take care.